So glad to be with you. You'll notice that our topic for this afternoon is world Christianity and the unfinished task. And since that just happens to be the title of my recent book, somehow, I thought this might be an appropriate occasion to talk with you about why I wrote this book, and I give you maybe just a few takeaways from this book that just came out actually just a few days ago. Almost all evangelicals care deeply about the work of mission, but individual interests, I realize, will vary. And some of you may have academic interest in the field of world Christianity, which I'm going to talk about in just a moment, and you simply want to know more about this exciting topic. Some of you will be leading a church or ministry that's engaged in global mission, and you'll be asked to weigh in on important decisions with some degree, we hope, of thoughtfulness. And a few of you may already be in leadership capacities. Some of you are actually contemplating perhaps a career in missions, and you have questions about your role in the global enterprise. And then there are probably a few of you who just like to, you're kind of like me, you like to explore interesting topics. And so we'll try to have something in this short talk for all of you. I wrote this book to introduce pastors, students, and laypersons to the study of world Christianity and its relationship to the unfinished task. Now, as you've probably already learned from your professors, it's important to pay attention to titles. They have a way of revealing a lot. This is one of the things I've learned from my friend and mentor, Dr. Sweeney. First, let's talk about world Christianity by asking the question, what is the difference between the study of Christian missions and the study of world Christianity? Now, since I spent quite a bit of time in the UK, that distinction is very, very clear. It's not as clear here in an American context. Now, I'm an American, and so it took me a little while to get my mind around what was simply, commonly accepted wisdom in the church in the UK. Very simply, missions is concerned with the transmission of the gospel from one place to another, while world Christianity focuses on indigenous expressions of the gospel within local contexts. And so missions would focus on the stories of missionaries and their work, which, by the way, you have beautiful displays here that I've enjoyed. And if you haven't spent any time around those displays, I would encourage you to do so. So missions would focus on the stories of missionaries and their work, while world Christianity would focus on the stories of local movements, churches, and leaders. And I'm going to come back to the title of the book here in just a moment and why this is important. The study of missions might look at, for example, the work of a missionary like Joe Church, who went to Uganda as a missionary in the 1920s, while the study of world Christianity would look at the history of the East African revival that Joe Church was a part of during that same period. So you have the study of missions and the history of Christian missions and the story of world Christianity, and you can see there is a distinction. We would think it a subtle distinction here, probably in the United States. In the UK, they would consider it a very important distinction. And here's why this is important. By using the title World Christianity, I'm making a statement. Christianity is not a Western religion, but a world religion, and we're living now in a new era of world Christianity where there are vibrant expressions of the faith on every continent of the world. And sometimes these vibrant expressions of the faith are dwarf the size of our own churches here, even in the Bible Belt here. They're massive movements. And I've read about them and also seen them with my own eyes. Just massive movements. And so I want to encourage readers to step back and think about mission, or missions, as we say here in the United States, in the context of world Christianity in the modern period. In other words, rather than mission being the context of talking about mission, I want world Christianity to be the context in which we talk about mission. That the church is now growing rapidly in the non-Western world. And so what does this mean for mission, our unfinished task? If mission is the calling of Christ to his church, then we must have a robust theology of the church. And one that is not American-centric. And I want people to step back from talking about strategies and move more toward what an African friend of mine said when I was asking the question, what is the role of the Western church? He said, well, we start those conversations by talking about what is the church. And he was kind of pushing back on my, as an American, I wanted, okay, tell me what I need to do. And he said, first of all, why don't you get to know me? And you and I get to know each other. And this was the late Douglas Carew, who went to be with the Lord. He was an evangelical thinker from Sierra Leone who lived in Kenya when I was there. Let's talk about the church. You and I are brothers and sisters in Christ. And in a nice sort of way, he was saying, don't bring me your prepackaged ideas about missions, putting cute titles on them as you Americans are so good at, and then bring them over here and say, okay, now let's partner together. All right, you follow me. Yeah, I read in the archives, I remember coming across the line and saying, you Americans love to talk about partnership, but your idea of partnership is the relationship between a horse and its rider. And we know who the horse is. I thought it was a very good way of capturing it. So what I wanted to do is say, let's think about what's happening in the world, and then let's have a conversation about mission. So that is sort of, I've gotten through the title now, okay? So I'm going to give you a few takeaways. Here's a few takeaways and maybe a few surprises. In the first chapter of my book, I introduced readers to the remarkable changes that have taken place in the church during the 20th century. I talked some about these in chapel during my sermon. Most of you are familiar with these statistics, so I'm not going to go into detail, but primarily 70% of the world's Christians live in the global south, and almost half of the world's missionaries are being sent out from the non-Western world to the rest of the world. And some of those missionaries, by the way, as Jehu Hansels talks about, are now coming here to the United States. So keep that in mind. I'm careful to say, as I cover the continents, I cover Christianity in Europe, and I just do it in one chapter: Christianity in Europe, Christianity in Latin America, Christianity in Africa, and Asia and Oceania. And I'm careful to say that this ordering of the continents in no way is, a statement about where Christianity came from. It did come from Asia, as we all know, and but Europe has had a significant influence on Christianity in the rest of the world. It's important to keep in mind that that in some places of the world, Christianity is much older than it is here in the United States. So, for example, in Africa, Christianity has been on the African continent since the first century. And many, by the way, of the independent church movements that arose in the early 20th century had the term Ethiopian in their title, because what they're saying is our connection is with the church here in Africa, not with the church that the missionaries brought with them. So the heartland of Christianity has shifted. Now, I think there's something, and I talk about this briefly in my book, and I'm going to add just a few additional comments here, that we can learn from Christianity on every continent. I love, for example, the emphasis in Latin America on the church's responsibility to the poor, to holistic mission, to integral mission that we were talking about yesterday during lunch. I've admired the perseverance of the saints in Asia during prolonged seasons of suffering and persecution. My friends in Africa have an understanding of community that I just challenges my American individualism in significant ways. And let me just say, dismiss the church in Europe. There are a lot of Christians still in Europe living out their faith in significant ways. And again, I have to say, as an American, and even though I was taught better by Dr. Sweeney, as an American going to Europe, I was like, these folks need to get it together here. But think about this: and keep in mind that Eastern Europe and Western Europe are quite different as well. And there are some renewal movements happening in Eastern Europe where Christianity is growing now. But think about this in Western Europe. If you've had to live in a context of intellectual hostility, you develop certain skills that can be a blessing to the rest of the church. And that's why we have people like Alistair McGrath and N.T. Wright. And I'm trying to think of some other names here. Let's see if John Lennox, for example, Leslie Newbigin. They're thinking in a context of intellectual hostility. And so they bring some answers that are very helpful for us, even I think in North America, that we can learn from. These are people who are trying to faithfully live out their faith in a different context. So my point, I'm going to quote the Apostle Paul here, is the Word of God did not originate with us. We're not the only people it has reached. And there's so much we can learn from the global church. Now, I do cite lots of works that you can go to. Kirstine Kim's work on world Christianity, I think, is one of the best in kind of fleshing this out. And then I talk in this book about the people behind this movement of the study of world Christianity. I talked yesterday about David Barrett. I want to mention another guy by the name of Andrew Walls, perhaps the most influential person in the study of world Christianity. You can pick up the kind of the Festschrift on him. It's sort of a kind of a bio on Andrew Walls. It's called Understanding World Christianity for like $6 or $7. It's a great little read, introduces you to Andrew Walls and the whole study of world Christianity. Walls graduated from Oxford with a PhD in church history. In 1957, he moved to Africa where he taught history, theology, and ministry in Sierra Leone and Nigeria, and he later admitted that his doctorate in church history from Oxford had not prepared him to teach church history in Africa. He said, basically what I got was, here's the study of church history. And it goes from Jerusalem to Rome, takes a nod back to Constantinople very briefly, and then makes its way up to Geneva and Wittenberg, and I'm saying, amen, that's right? I mean, and then it ends up in Scotland, and then Andrew Walls later says, we're going to stop teaching clan history, and we're going to start teaching church history. And so the way he described it was, church history was clan history, and then if you wanted to know about what was happening in the rest of the world, that's mission studies. And so we'll throw a chapter in there on mission studies, and that will cover everything else. Those people who are not living here in the Western world. So one can see how non-Western people might feel like we're ignoring them a little bit. And so, getting back to the title of my book, I want people to think world Christianity before they begin thinking about missions. And I want them to think about missions within the context of world Christianity. By the way, some of my work is based on field research and conversations earlier on before I did my PhD studies, in which I basically went around Africa asking the question to my African friends, what do you think the role of Western missionaries should be? And I did this for a long, long time, to the point where they were tired of it. In fact, I remember I was teaching at the Nairobi Evangelical Graduate School of Theology, and I was having these interesting conversations. And so I finally said to one of these a young lady who came in, she's very, very bright, doing her MDiv, and I had like 50 students in my class, and they're all there to hear what the white guy had to say, I think. And so, I said, hey, I just want to ask you, do you think I should even be here? And because I kind of sensed an edge, to her. And I just wanted to kind of, and she goes, no, not really. I said, well, at least we kind of know, I know where you are, you know where I am. And but then I did say, we laughed, I said, now, if you were invited to, teach at Trinity Evangelical Divinity School in Deerfield, Illinois. Would you accept the position? She goes, touche, okay, all right, yeah. Now, here's why Andrew Walls changed the conversation. Here's why this is important. We now know a lot more about the global church and the way the global church thinks. We have a better understanding of the relationship between Christianity and colonialism. And I would just say, just at the outset, most of the non-Western world, I don't think that's too much of a statement, strong of a statement. I would say most of the non-Western world is still suffering from what one of my friends used to call, or still calls, the colonial hangover. In other words, they still have attitudes toward Western people that we're often not aware of, because it takes a while to develop that friendship where they're going to be really honest with you, right? And we're learning a lot of that about that in our conversations about race as a culture, if we can call them conversations, some of them that we're having here this last year as a culture. There's significant pushback. In fact, we've learned this, we're learning this. I'm going to talk about something that our center is studying in Cambridge. One of our associates there is studying persecution in the non-Western world. He's South Asian. And one of the things that he's learning is that persecution isn't always caused by a person's faith. Sometimes people are being persecuted because of their national identity. And then we're calling that, in other words, someone may not like me because I'm an American, and it has nothing to do with my faith and everything to do with my national identity. And so that information is very helpful for mission studies and helping us understand, where should we send someone? I'm probably not the best fit for Somalia, right? But people living in northern Kenya might be a very good fit for Somalia. So again, I don't want to tell you everything. You won't buy my book, all right? The second thing, we know a lot more about the missionaries themselves. You think of Barbara Kingsolver's portrayal of a failed Southern Baptist missionary to the Congo in the 1950s. And it's a I found it to be a very enjoyable novel, even though Baptist ministers typically don't read the Apocrypha, and that's, most of her chapter titles are the Apocrypha. Is interesting. But I'll mention two ways in which her caricature is misleading. First of all, we now know that most of the world's missionaries were women, not men. In fact, nearly two-thirds of the world's missionaries were women. And Dana Roberts' work has shown that the suppression of women's rights in the modern period led to many Western women going to places where they felt free to make a difference, which was on the mission field. In fact, many of them, her research shows, sought out men who were going to be missionaries because they knew that was their ticket to go be a missionary. And so women have significantly changed the world. Young people have significantly changed the world through the student volunteer movement. That's a little more widely known. People who have graduated from colleges and universities and seminaries have changed the world. Cambridge University was a center for missionary activity during the modern period, and it rivals. We now know this. From my colleague Brian Stanley, who's done some work on this, and Ian Randall, who's done a lot of work on this. Cambridge University rivals institutions like Moody, Gordon, and Wheaton for graduates who served in the work of overseas missions. While most people know the story of C.T. Studd and the Cambridge Seven, what is often not told is that this kind of sacrifice was not unusual. Thousands of young people, and this gets me really excited, and it's exciting to look out and see you here. Thousands of young people left lives of privilege to serve as missionaries, humbly serving the church as teachers and doctors and linguists and ordained ministers of the gospel. And so much for the idea that the acquisition of education is at odds with the evangelization of the world. That simply is not the case. In fact, most of the world's missionaries were better educated than their peers. And then the third thing I would say, we've learned that while colonialism opened doors And while missionaries entered those doors, it wasn't, the work of missions wasn't the extension of the colonial apparatus. In fact, to use a phrase from Dana Robert, missionaries were at work converting the colonial apparatus for their own ends. Just as I would be on a flight, to Kenya on British Airways with maybe a government official or a business leader, but I would be there for a different reason. We know that missionaries converted the colonial apparatus. Now, there was certainly compromise, there was disagreement. Missionaries sometimes compromised themselves in significant ways, and in the minds of non-Western people, they sometimes did not distinguish between the missionary and the colonial officer, though many were able to do that. Now, here's where I'm going to come to a conclusion, and we'll have a few minutes for questions. So I kind of cover this, and then I ask the question, well, so what? But before I answer the question, so what, which I'm going to be spending the afternoon in the class with some of you students talking about the so what questions a little bit more, I delved more into the issue of race and world Christianity. And I did this actually prior to the death of George Floyd. I was working on this for about 6 months, and but I found discovered I had come across some interesting things in my research. I wanted to talk about this a little bit more. I noticed in my research that while we may think of civil rights as an American movement, it was in fact a global movement, and interestingly, many parts of the world were ahead of us here in the United States. In fact, in the 1950s and 60s, we know now that many of our American politicians felt pressure from the rest of the world to sort of clean up their act, especially during the Cold War period. They were concerned, we've got to clean up our act because it's a fight now between the United States and communism, and communism is very appealing to the underclass, to people who are struggling to make it, and capitalism is struggling to win over African leaders. And so many African leaders, for example, were attracted to communism. And so what many leaders in the United States said, we've got to clean up our act. In other words, it was much more pragmatic than we would like to think. We've got to clean up our act here. We've got to get things together. We also know that Western missionaries who were serving abroad were in fact on the forefront of issues regarding race and racism. And many missionaries were highly influential as advocates for racial justice, due in part to their friendships that they developed with people in the non-Western world. They were more progressive in their attitudes toward race and racial justice because of the friendships that they developed. There's a nice takeaway we could talk about. I think one of the best things we can do to address the issue of race is just be friends, right? Eat together, play together, work together, spend time together. Now, why is all of this important? Because, and by the way, David Hollinger, who he's not a Christian, he's an atheist, but he wrote a very interesting book called Protestants Abroad, How Missionaries Tried to Change the World but Changed America. And I had a conversation with David a few months ago. And I said, David, he talks about how missionaries go out, they're changed by the world, they come back, and many of them were involved in the civil rights movement, for example. I said, David, why don't people write about, this? He's talking about mainline Protestants. He goes, pure prejudice, Lionel, pure prejudice. That's what he said, our prejudice against missionaries. And he said, but we now know, this is David, who is, a fine scholar, not a believer. We're developing a bit of a relationship. Don't tell him that I'm doing evangelism work. So I really like the guy. I really like him. But, he said, we now know that these missionaries actually had more progressive views than people who lived at home, and they're coming back to educate us. Now, here's my point. The people living in the non-Western world are very, very aware that race is still an issue. And when you go from this context to that context, you need to bear that in mind and keep that in mind in how you position yourself. And if you're out there alone, and I'm now leading to the class that we're going to, kind of doing your thing, and you're not working under the authority of a non-Western church, you're going to stand out. And there are going to be questions that are going to be raised about your effectiveness. So why is all this so important for the unfinished task? Because Western missionaries sent out by the Western church are going out to a world that has rejected white rule, that has rejected Western rule in all its forms. And if we take a go-it-alone approach to mission in the non-Western world where Christianity is growing rapidly and white rule has been rejected, it will make our work much more difficult. But there's opportunities all over this, right? For us to be going together, for us to be working together. I mean, there's opportunities all over this for mission and for the global church. So I want to put world Christianity, I want to put missions into the context of world Christianity. That's why I wrote this book. So, all right, I think we have like 5 minutes for questions. And I'd be glad to take questions. And I think that, are people watching us?
Yes.
Okay, all right. That's all. I should have asked that before, right? So I'm supposed to repeat any questions that people have. Or you can make a comment if you want, Gloria, I told you if I say anything I disagree with, feel free to disagree with me. And you can even do it in front of people. I don't mind.
Well, now that you give me permission. I do have a question. First, I'm so thankful for your perspective and your insight. I think, I'm grateful. I'm thankful. I think I have 2 questions, mainly. One of them being talking about world Christianity and missions and the task of let's define our terms, let's talk about it instead of just assuming we all know what we're talking about. I want to also find the tension and the balance, I guess, between I'm called to do missions, and I've had conversations where people have said to me, we're all called to do missions. We're all missionaries. If you're a follower of Christ, you're sharing the gospel anywhere you are. And I agree with that, but how do you kind of talking to the importance of saying I'm a missionary? And that's still important for me to say. And that's different from ministering in your local context.
Yeah. The question that Gloria is asking is how do we have conversations about the importance of being a missionary and that calling? And I just want to say, just a brief response from me. As an evangelical, I want to affirm you in your calling, and I want to encourage you to go out there and change the world. You're obviously going to be much more aware of what's happening in world Christianity because you lived in Calcutta and spent so much time in that part of the world. But what I want to say to Americans and people who are living in the West is I want to affirm your calling, but I want you to also know, as an American, the world has changed. And I think my experience has been that Americans are not quite as aware of that as other people are in Europe and in the non-Western world. We're a big island, and we speak like one language. And so I want to affirm your calling and say amen to it. And then I also want people to understand the new context in which they're going out to serve the world. And there's all kinds of opportunities. Let's talk about the big cities now around the world. Where half of the world now is living in large cities. And there's, missions look so different today, but it can be really, really exciting.
You talk about how the world is so different now outside of the United States. How can we as Americans get a good understanding of how that has changed if we don't have the opportunity to go to a different place and see how it's active?
Well, there's a great book called World Christianity: The Unfinished Task. I would start with that. So, that would be a good. And that you need to get that for a lot of your friends too, and make sure. I think that as evangelicals, we have this, and this is a wonderful thing about evangelicals. I think this this penchant to be up and doing, up and going. And what I'm saying is, and I'm one of them. Let's give some careful reflection. That might be reading, that might be traveling, that might be doing what you're doing right now. You're learning more about the world in this program right here at Beeson, and giving some time to careful thought, and then go out there and make a difference in the world. So I do think, though, I'm going to push Americans a little bit. I feel like that's one of my roles, and I'm an American, and I've spent some time in the non-Western world. I feel like one of my callings is to kind of push Americans a little bit, and to say, let's be aware of this world of world Christianity, and think about missions in the context of world Christianity. And by the way, in my book, there is a number of, the bibliography is probably 20 pages. So there's plenty of resources that you can find there on just about any subject in world Christianity. Bill.
I asked your wife a similar question, but what is the one thing you hope for in future missionaries?
Yeah, well, I'm going to get, my wife gave a really good answer, and the word was humility. And I think that it's one of the things I appreciate about Dean Sweeney, that he models for us. I told my wife, I don't know that I've met anyone that that has this beautiful combination of someone that's brilliant and someone that's genuinely humble. And I think that's something that is not only attractive, but something that is needed in our world as Americans, that we just go out there. I remember I'm teaching, even for non-Western people, I was teaching students in Nairobi who are getting MDivs. It's just unheard of in a place like Africa. One of my students came to me and said, I've got my MDiv, and the only job I have is to be a chaplain in Kibera, which means burying children every other day who've died of AIDS. And I said, take it and roll up your sleeves and go serve the poor. And in 2 years, you'll be doing something else, but go. And I said, go do it. Just say, humbly go out there and serve and inspire. It inspires people like me, and can change the world. So humility and a willingness to serve wherever God calls you.
Right. Thank you so much. It's now time to roll up your sleeves and go to class. Thank you.